Alright, so let's start. Let's quickly revise a bit whatever we have learned so far. So you can have classes, then you can classes holds members and methods. Then there are three types of variables: local, instance, and static variables. Static. And one more thing is there is a concept of keywords in Java programming. You cannot use certain keywords in your programming language, right? Like you can use, like you're writing a code, you cannot use these words like abstract, continue, because these are reserved and these do some things within like if condition and all, right? So those you cannot do. So these are a big list of keywords that you cannot use. Now looking at class constructor, as we have already seen that example, constructor is a special which has the same name as class. It does not have a return type. It has to be public. It is executed only once. Object can never be created without invoking a constructor. And it can be overloaded with values. You can see second prog has got the same name, but it is parameterized. So constructor overloading is like may have several constructors. This feature is called constructor overloading. It's called constructor overloading. So we have seen this. A class can have several constructors. It's called overloading, or each is different by the parameter list. How they have the same name of the class, but the parameters will change. Okay, and the signature of each constructor must differ. When I say signature, the method should be different. Okay, you cannot have another employee method having the same fname, lname, email. You have to add or reduce a parameter. Now let's look at a constructor difference between a method and a constructor. Java constructor is used to initialize the state of an object. Constructor does not have return type, whereas methods must have a return type. Either it is void or something. Methods are used to expose the behavior of an object. Like we saw, we could assign values. So constructor is invoked implicitly, method is invoked explicitly. You have to call a method, constructor is automatically invoked. If you don't define a constructor, Java compiler will automatically create a default constructor provide. Method is not provided by compiler. These are your custom method. Constructor name must be the same name as the class name. Method name may or may not be as same as the class name. Now we have seen, we'll be seeing static class, static block, and methods. Okay, we can have these three things. Now what is this? Static variables belong to the class and not to the object. Now what is the object? You remember employee new we created. If you do not remember, go back to that code please and see the script. So these don't belong to that object. When you say object or method name, set values and all you called, right? You cannot do it like this. Now the static variables are initialized only once at the start of an execution. These variables are initialized first before the initialization of any instance. A single copy is going to be shared by all instances. So to understand this, we will actually see an example. So similarly, you can have a static block. So we already seen it's a static block is a block of statement inside a Java class that will be executed in the class's first loop. We already seen that. So now this is an example of static variables. So we are not given them as public. Even you can give them public or private, whatever. But if you say static, it becomes static. If you want to get normal, if you don't specify static, they are non-static members. So far we have created non-static members. Static int num, there are two. Now there is a static block, and within the static block we can assign values to static variables. Now methods are of two types. We already seen methods. There are static methods and non-static. If you specify static keyword, it becomes a static method, and all static methods can access static members of that class. That is, if there are static variables in the class, you can access it via the static members, static methods. Non-static members cannot access the static members. Non-static members can only access the non-static variables. So static method again belongs to the class, not to the object, can access only the static data, and it can call only other static methods. And static method can be accessed by the class name and does not need any object. Okay, it cannot do some things like super or this, which comes in inheritance. And whereas an instance methods are not declared as static, anything that you don't give static are known as instance methods and variables. To refer, you must instantiate the class. That is, you will create a new class and then say object.className, object.methodName. Sorry, not object.className. First, for static, you don't need to initiate a class. Instantiate a class. The same runs for methods also. So if you see down, this person, methods and variables are not declared as static or known as instance methods and instance variables. To refer instance method and variables, you must instantiate the class. Now see, your public class person has got a add method. So you say person, variable, new person, and then you say dot add. Otherwise, you can just say, if it is static method, you can say person dot add. So let's take a look at both of this. Static, the other one we have already seen. So if you go to company.java, see what you're doing here. See EMP. Now these are non-static members. Okay, you say emp.getValue, emp.lastName, right? What I'll do here is, this iterator one is being called from public static void. Now this is a static method, correct? So what I'll do is, I will remove this static keyword and save this. And now when I scroll down, it gives me an error here. It says, cannot make static reference to non-static methods. That is because this is now a non-static method and you cannot call it from a static method, which is main. So we need to make it as static. Okay, this is one example of a difference between static. And another thing is, if you say this, it should work, and run this, it will run fine. Okay, now suppose we already have this class, right? So this class is called third. So similarly, if you create a package like this, so similarly, if you come to our employee class and you try to create a static method here, it's going to give you the same crib. Okay, if you say static here and run it, what will happen is, in the company method you'll get an error. See, cannot use this in static context. The problem here is, these last name, first name and all are non-static methods. Okay, but if I give this .id, it will work. This will work as an ID. Okay. So now basically I can access the static variable from a static method. Okay. So try to understand this key difference. Actually, I'm not going to execute this. This is just to understand what's happening. We can get values. We can keep it back to what it was. Okay. And you cannot use this when you make it static. Okay. Now, one more thing is, I can directly access this value over here. Now, if I say like actually, it should give me the static. So if we go here again in the company.java, yeah, so now it's visible. Can you see? See, now this static variable is the only one I'm able to access it directly by the name of the class. Access that value. Static methods can access static variables, and when you have static variables in a class, you can directly give the class name dot value. You don't need an object instance to get that value. So if I run this, it will print the value over here. Similarly, if I have a static method, usually your methods, most of them will be public, but if you want data control, there are tight, strict data control, what method should access what variable, then you start using static. That is totally depending on your programming requirements. Okay. And now this is a static method in employee. Try to understand here. Now if I go over here to my company class and here print. See here, the key difference, guys, here is, now if I say emp plus, won't ask directly from here. This employee, you don't need to call it via the emp object. You can still call it via the emp object. There also it is accessible, but you don't need to do it there. If you run this, see, all this static method ran, so you're calling all the things directly, right? So employee dot using the class name, you're calling the static method. Right? An importance method we have already seen, that emp dot. Now let us look at a concept of, before we start inheritance, I want you to completely practice the previous things of creating a class, the constructor, the different members, overloading the constructor, creating static members, non-static members, public members, private members, accessing the private members via your public methods. Okay, try all of that and then only proceed to these topics.